but we have a little more to dig out of it today. So um, our focus today is again on the mythic mind to help to bring it more fully into focus what he's talking about. And I think for today, I definitely want to do a more text oriented session than we've been doing for a while and really kind of dig into this and see what we can get out of it. So this issue of the mythic mind, um, I think the critical thing, we've talked before about this idea that um, the Greeks gave us this framework of gnosis and noesis, in which gnosis represents this harder to pin down, more intuitive, more kind of whole forming synthetic faculty that we have, and that gives us the ability to connect to things below the surface in nature outside of ourselves and things below the surface in our own inner nature, access to dreams and memories and feelings and so forth. Whereas noesis gives us this explicit format, this for thinking, this formalizing, systematizing, measuring faculty, and that both of them are necessary. It's not the case that one is the good faculty and the other is the bad faculty. It's that Homo sapiens evolved that we need both of them. And they both have to be functioning well. Otherwise, it's like trying to make do with a heart but no lungs, or lungs but no heart. They both are critical to the way that the mind works. This is the Greek framework. And so Hegel reframes this in terms of processes of development and dialectics. And his framework builds on top of it. Um, and it includes Begriff, Verstand, and Vernunft. And Begriff is a naive form of gnosis, because when we're born, we already have sort of undeveloped, raw, gnosic faculties that have been operating since we were in the womb. And those faculties are, after our physical birth, those faculties are, I guess I can understate things by saying stimulated by the enormous world into which we've been born, which is full of sensations that the newborn is not prepared for. It doesn't know how to interpret. It's all just taken in raw like a live wire. So that's Begriff in its initial form, and over time, Begriff develops into something more sophisticated, in which Verstand, the second faculty, has been developing enough to aid it to make some kind of sense out of what we're sensing. And so our relationship to the sensual world, the experiential world, while we're still operating in Begriff, it shifts from this sort of confused kind of live wire Begriff to this more situated, holistic Begriff in which we feel like we know our place. We feel like, and I don't mean know abstractly, I mean we feel like we belong in the world. The world no longer feels weird and alien and external to us. It starts to feel like this is our home and we know it. And as a result of that familiarity that's developed, the gnosis and also the services provided by Verstand, Begriff develops into this mode where we are able to do something that an intellectual would resist, but incorrectly, calling reasoning about ourselves and our world. That is to say, a Begriff person is not merely irrational. It's not merely the absence of rationality of Verstand. A Begriff, someone who's centered in Begriff, has an interpretive framework for the world that's based fundamentally on what they experience, what they remember, what they feel, on connecting themselves to all their experiences and trying to make a whole picture or organism out of that experience. So for someone who is operating at a deeply Begriff level, for example, dreams are meaningful, not to be discarded as noise or as, ephemera, because they're part of your experience and they're usually emotionally powerful. So they pull together a lot of different aspects of the experience of life. Whereas to a Verstand person, the second stage of development, who is in the process of rejecting their earlier Begriff life, the Verstand person in the process of intellectualizing, becoming educated, systematized, becoming interested in climbing through systems and rising, they downplay the importance of feelings. They downplay the importance of dreams. They downplay the importance of memories. They downplay personal experience, and they start wanting things to make sense numerically, logically, systematically. So, for example, when we say, well, most people who are treated with this medicine, they experience the certain benefits and certain drawbacks. And so that is what the medicine is and what it does. And if your experience is different, well, then you're an anomaly, and we're going to not talk about you. You're going to get pushed out of the picture as not being relevant to the truth. So Verstand is interested in a truth that's selective from reality. And it's selective based on what fits with my system of thinking and what doesn't. How can I make sense of the world through my abstractions and ideologies? And what do I have to do to defend those ideologies and abstractions from any threats, whether irrational threats, anomalous threats? They all have to be suppressed and controlled in order to protect the ideology to which our loyalty has now been shifted. And you see this kind of epitomized, Verstand is epitomized with, I think, therefore I am. Right? The obsession is my brain is the real me, and the rest of me is some sort of spacesuit or appendage, and I'm going to devalue it. That's all horrible Begriff stuff, and I don't want anything to do with that. I want to cherry pick my evidence in order to protect the framework that my mind is building, the work of my mind. This is the Verstand. So Verstand is embracing noesis, but it's embracing a noesis in a way that rejects gnosis. Right? Here, there has been a revolution in which the relationship between gnosis and noesis that a mature Begriff person has now been upended. And rather than Verstand being developed only to the extent that it supports and reinforces gnosis, as the gnosis being the master, with Verstand, we've upended the relationship, and now it's noesis that must be the master. Our education, our ideas, our ideologies, our logics, our math, this is the master. And experience and feelings and dreams, these things are only allowed to participate to the extent that they are helpful to noesis, right? If they reinforce what we want to think, we prove that we're right by cherry picking a certain amount of gnosic information and keeping it in shackles in a subservient relationship. And any gnosic information that threatens the integrity of our systems, that has to be controlled and suppressed. So Verstand thinking, hypernoetic thinking, one-sided noetic thinking, has a tendency to be obsessed with law and order, with control, with stopping the chaos. Chaos is the enemy. We must destroy chaos and irrationality and suppress them. Or we must eliminate them through education or conversion, or there's always some methodology we use to try to get that side, we say, under control, but what we mean is to be a slave to noesis. Noesis is to be the master, and gnosis is to be the slave. And in Hegel's framework, Begriff and Verstand are both one-sided, half-witted approaches to life. Begriff is focused on the gnosic side, and Verstand is focused on the abstracting, systematizing, intellectualizing side. And neither Begriff nor Verstand is a problem in and of itself unless we buy into this mindset in which one of them is to be preferred and the other is to be avoided. That is to say, in a healthy mind, what we've evolved to is to have a rich river of Begriff information coming at us, and also a rich river of Verstand information coming at us, which we are to integrate into Vernunft, where we use them to augment each other, we pit them against each other, we create a dynamic system out of them so that each can correct the other and be informed by the other. That's the goal to get towards. But we get into trouble when instead we deviate into one of these kind of half-witted strategies where we only use one or the other. So there's this kind of Greek slash Arendt slash, I mean, I guess I should put Nietzsche in there too, slash Smith framework of douloi, banausoi, and aristoi. And this is the level at which we're finally dealing with not just a faculty of the mind or a strategy, but the actual resulting mentality. These are the mindsets, the kind of personality or character types that develop out of Gnosis and Noesis and out of Begriff, Verstand, and Vernunft. That one becomes the kind of person, if you become the kind of person who is focused on naive Gnosis, on Begriff, at the expense of Verstand, then you're a doulos. That is to say, you're a slave of your experiences. And if you embrace instead the Verstand side of life, Noesis at the expense of Gnosis, and suppress, the information that Begriff is bringing to you in order to protect your Noetic intellectual Verstand structures, then you become another kind of slave. You become a slave of your ideologies, and that's what a banausos is. A banausos is a slave of his ideas and intellect and framework, in the same way that a doulos is a slave of his experiences and feelings and sensations. And so the point of this framework is that, Homo sapiens is supposed to go through a series of births, first the physical birth, and then two more cognitive births that come after that, until we finally are born into the mature adult mind, the mythic mind of the Aristos. And the Aristos is the person who refuses to be a slave. And it's although in Greek society that started out meaning you refuse to be physically a slave, to be enslaved by another person, in the philosophical framework that developed out of that slave culture, it transformed into refusing to be a slave either of your experiences or of your ideas. That is, refusing to be either a doulos or a banausos, refusing either to wallow exclusively in Begriff or to wallow exclusively in Verstand. Even though both of those are attractive and easy to fall into, they're gravity wells. We are naturally, it's a pitfall of the psychology of Homo sapiens that each of them seems to be self-sufficient, and it reinforces itself and defends itself and tries to keep you there. They're not just stages of development we pass through, they're traps that we have to escape, or else we don't actually succeed in being born into the next stage of development. So the mythic mind is not the superstitious mind. I mean, from the ancient perspective, the mythic mind is not the primitive mind. It's not the mind of bad science. It's not the mind of popular tall tales. It is the mind that engages in Vernunft and Aristeia. That's the mythic mind that he's talking about here. He's not describing mythos as a primitive stage that we want to grow out of on our way to logos. It's natural for us as moderns to want to read the relationship that way, but he means, in fact, the opposite, if anything. That the production of myths, even during earlier stages of development for the Greeks, was not done by douloi and banausoi. It was done by aristoi. Aristoi produced myths. It's their function within a culture. Because to produce a genuine myth, in the sense that Kenneth Smith's talking about here, you have to have access both to the Begriff information and to the Verstand information, and to be able to show their interdependency, to tell a compelling, unforgettable story that illustrates some difficult truth, something that is necessary for life, but that is very easy to overlook. And through your gifts of rhetoric and storytelling, you transform it into something that's impossible to overlook, so that it can be used to help educate the douloi and banausoi and help them rise to become better than they would otherwise be, and to create a more nourishing cultural matrix for the production of aristoi. Right? He refers frequently to this idea that each of these births requires. I mean, he alludes to this idea that these additional births beyond the physical one, require midwives. They require crisis, and they require assistance. You need help, just like women frequently need help to give physical birth. So it's true for all of us to be born into the next stage of mental development. We need help. And so the production of a rich mythos, assuming it's a real mythos and not a fake saccharine substitute mythos, if it's a real mythos, then being immersed in and marinating in these stories from childhood will help to turn the underdeveloped mind in the direction of the lessons that need to be learned in order to rise, in order to be born to the next stage of development. I mean, they want to reinforce the story of Oedipus, not for modern reasons, to make money or to be famous or what have you, or to express themselves. It's because if you don't know that you can be the best and the brightest available, and still, through the action of your virtues, cause the very, very worst possible things to happen, then you don't understand the human condition. You lack skepticism about your gifts. You have to understand the dangers of being a finite mortal trying to engage with an infinite world. And if you understand those dangers, you have a better chance of coming right in the end. But if you don't understand those dangers, if you're an ego monster who thinks, the human mind is the greatest of all possible creations and we will surely be like the gods, you're going to end up probably worse than Oedipus. God help you. So, by having kids marinating in these stories, they're trying to put together unforgettable examples, paradigms. This is how the term is used, right? An unforgettable example that makes it very hard to miss the point. And it's intriguing enough that you want to remember the story anyway. Not only can't you forget it, you are drawn to it. You carry it with you. In fact, you want to tell the story yourself. It's that good. And the result of that is that cognitive development through these stages towards the adult mythic mind is promoted rather than suppressed. This is the framework he's talking about in Mythos and Logos. And this is what he means by the mythic mind. By the mythic mind, he doesn't mean the mind that's overrun with delusions and superstitions. He means the mind capable of producing genuine myths that understands what's at stake and why this has to be its mission. Why we're all in trouble if somebody isn't doing this for us, to help put the thumb on the scales in the direction of development and away from stagnation and self-destruction. I'll pause here. Phil, go ahead. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, as you were telling this story, it really reminds me back at the kind of decisive moment between Plato and the poets. I mean, that was in a sense the birth of this, I guess, debate. And it seemed to me at that point it was somewhat equally balanced. And I could sort of understand Plato. Like he sort of, if you think about his forms, he sort of think of the forms as like getting more and more clarity, from when you're born, apparently, whether it was from a separate life that you already learned something already, or whether it's just like there was no separate life, you were born, you came out of the cosmos, and it had a diagram of sorts, but the trauma of birth had made you forgot all those things, and now you're thrown into the world. And of course, he doesn't have the advantage of Sigmund Freud or Carl Jung or even David Hume to think about the psychology of that, but he was just thinking about the form. And so I could see how he could see that his project was to try to retrieve this sort of ambiguity and vagueness that the birth trauma has caused to get a sharper and sharper focus on what the forms were, because they are real. Okay, so I understand that. It just seems to me that the poet's arguing like, yeah, but you don't really quite get it because, you know, you are not an infinite mind, despite the fact that you you could be quite smart, and Plato was very, very smart, and that you could only sharpen things to a certain degree, because the problem with gaining the forms is really the notion that an artist has said, like, not more is less, but more is the sum total of less. So therefore, what you want to do is you want to shed the ambiguity, because it was caked on with all sorts of excesses. So therefore, in a sense, you need to lose the ambiguity and get to the essence of what that thing is, which is the forms. And so therefore becomes a kind of purity by losing what you might call the cake on dust fakery that covers over the essence of what it is. But if you're thinking about the infinity, then in a sense, or even if not infinity, very, very large, is that no, those cake on things are real. they are real. It's and you can't just lose them, like like certain things. Yes, you should lose. So losing the difference is, in a sense, to get to the purity, is in some sense losing losing the essence of the totality. So that seems to be the argument. And it's just interesting, like the time between Socrates and Plato. Socrates just sort of had the beginning of that, but he just says, well, I don't know. I just don't know, right? And Plato is sort of say, oh, yes, you do. We just need to clarify that.
Yeah.
Because the oracles have said that you are the smartest man in the world. You're just a little bit too pious. You need to say you do know, because the oracles. Now, of course, then that becomes funny, because if the oracles are the gods know more than you. So therefore, in a sense, that's also a problem, right? So
Right.
you have to actually, in some sense, as Plato say, yeah, your understanding is better than the gods. Oh, that's not only like leaving on the cake on realities that there is, but that's also blasphemy against the God. Now, of course, you could say, in some sense, you could justify it. The gods, at least the gods we know, the Greek gods, they're just like superhuman beings. They're like fighting and quibbling over everything. They're not any better than we are. That's why I always insist that Plato was waiting for Augustine, the absolute God. So that's my thought. I mean, just that moment was very interesting, because it equated the debate between the two. And once it got consolidated and Plato essentially won, then in a sense you could see the destiny of Western thought was going to be a destiny of purification. All right. That's it.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, that's right on the money. It's interesting that most people just divide the Greek philosophers into the pre-Socratic philosophers and everybody else, but Nietzsche didn't. After studying the differences between Plato and Socrates, Nietzsche decided that his book on the early philosophers was called the pre-Platonic philosophers. He says Socrates is more like the strange, difficult to pin down philosophers before Plato than he is like Plato. and that Plato's performing a kind of philosophical alchemy to kind of make Socrates his guy, even though Socrates is really from an earlier generation of philosophical thought. It's interesting. So to finish fleshing out this framework a little bit, I've mentioned before that Hegel admired, he didn't entirely endorse, but he admired Friedrich Schiller's framework of personality and thought in Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, in which he laid out a series of comparison, in which he laid out a threefold set of different drives within human beings, and he hadn't quite arranged them into stages of development the way that Hegel does, but he distinguished the three at least, which is something. So he has Sinnestrieb, which is the sensuous drive, and if you read in the aesthetic education what he means by Sinnestrieb, you'll recognize a fair amount of Begriff in it. This idea that what you're sensing is the predominant driver of your thought. And then Schiller also has what he calls Formtrieb, which is the formal drive. And Formtrieb, you can see in its focus on kind of formal systematizing thinking, the relationship to Hegel's Verstand, right? They're obviously related to each other. And from that, we also get his third drive, which is Spieltrieb, or play drive. And in this playfulness, we see Phil's equivocation, right? The not wanting to commit yourself to either the sensuous drive or the formal drive, but the drive to play with ideas. And in that it comes hand in hand from a Kenneth Smith perspective with the development of taste, discrimination, the ability to choose between these two different sources of information. You play with them to learn what they can do and what they can't do, and then as you gain proficiency with that, you learn to select better between them for which one applies to which situation. And in that we see Vernunft, Hegel's Vernunft, and the Greek Nietzschean Arendt Smith Aristeia. Now, the main difference here is that because Schiller's just portraying them as drives within a human being and not getting into the question of does one of them dominate over the others within a specific person, and if it did, what does that do to your character? What kind of person do you become? And if a lot of people become that kind of person, what does it do to your culture? This idea of deriving stages of development of the person or the culture or history itself out of this is not present yet in Schiller. This is what Hegel brings to it, in addition to sort of refining the definitions. But it's useful to make these connections anyway, just to help see the shape of the problem and how people have worked on it. And because it's more terminology to work with. I mean, Hegel and the existentialists who follow him and have developed the ideas further would all agree that in general, Schiller's right, that these capacities within us are drives. We are born with more than one perspective, or a drive to develop more than one perspective. The mind is not a unity. It contains conflict within it. It contains competition within it for what are you going to attend to? How are you going to derive your next thought, depending on which drive has the richest, juiciest information to try to steal the limelight of your mind as you're forming your next thought. This is another dimension to the problem of what is the nature of our mind and how do we think. So you can see from this, given the alignment of what Kenneth Smith calls the mythic mind with Hegel's Vernunft and Aristeia, and with the ancient Greek combination of gnosis and noesis, you can see that it aligns well with Schiller's Spiel drive, and that from that the mythic mind has a playfulness to it, right? You are playing with ideas, searching for their most revealing, illuminating, persuasive form to try to create your myths, right? You're trying to figure out how can you convey the deeper truths of life that are necessary for human development in the most unforgettable ways. That you're not gonna do that like God at his drafting board writing out from the beginning, exactly perfect the first time the list of commandments. That's not how the finite human mind works. The only way to pull it off is to play with these ideas a lot. I think about the way that classical composers typically kept notebooks in which, like a police investigator, they're constantly jotting down notes to themselves, something they hear in the street, some folk tune, some bird song. Mozart used to transcribe the bird songs outside his window. He's playing. What do I hear? What is this? And then later he would go back and look at his transcriptions and say, what can I do with this? Where can this lead? How can it develop? And sometimes the connections are obvious, like when he does his little opera about the birds, the bird people. And there's a tremendous amount of bird-like sounds in the arias. But most of the time, that play has allowed him to develop things quite different from the bird song, like when he develops his Requiem. And yet, the play that came before was essential to the development of even the profound, serious Requiem itself. It's you have to explore and search and try things out, and that takes time. If you're kept busy all the time chasing how you're going to make next month's rent and keep yourself from being homeless, then you're not going to have the time to play. It's all that's necessary to suppress the development of the mythic mind is to keep everybody really busy as a matter of life or death, right? Your health's at stake, your home's at stake, whether you eat your next meal is at stake. And we're going to come to that more in this book as we dig into modernity and its structure and what it's for. But in this, what we see basically is not just one philosopher, not just one idea, not just Kenneth Smith making some claim, but we're seeing multiple people, multiple thinkers across thousands of years of history have arrived at the same conclusion, that the human mind has multiple competing drives, and that the process of maturation involves going through stages of development to get there. Just like we've long recognized that's true physically, a number of philosophers have said that's true cognitively. And so this Kenneth Smith's philosophy about human character types is not some invention of his. It's his attempt to draw together these ideas. And critical to these ideas, and this is what section F is about, is this idea that mythos is not a primitive stage of logos. Logos culture, if anything, is a devolution. Even if it's a natural stage of development, it is a devolution from mythos culture. And the idea that things can decay, that they can flourish at an apex and then begin to collapse down from that apex, is something that we're all forced to recognize in our own biological lives, because that's the arc of our biology, to rise towards an apex and flourish for a time and then to begin to fall away. But it's something that modernity ideologically predisposes us to not welcome and not want to believe in. It's absolutely in opposition to the Great March of Progress. And we are promised the Great March of Progress as our birthright, as moderns. Things are just going to get better and better. And as a result of that, we must be the best so far, because nothing has come after us yet. History must just be this great march to our own coronation as great angels of reason who see the world as it actually is. The idea that it's possible for a culture to rise to an apex and then begin to fall away. First of all, we might be willing to acknowledge that for other primitive peoples in the past, but we don't want to acknowledge that for ourselves. Modernity is the culture that wants to deny its own death. And even if we did acknowledge it for primitive cultures in the past, what we absolutely would not tolerate is the idea that when some other culture flourished and they were at their apex, they weren't like us. But when they began to decay, they became like us. That's unthinkable, inexpressible. That's blasphemy to modernity. It cannot possibly be that our most cherished values and our way of life represents something subpar, sort of a maldevelopment of human culture and potential. That's not okay. From to the modernist ideology, that must not be so. And it's why it's so incredibly hard to grasp this idea that the Greeks were at their peak when they were a mythos culture. And as they transitioned into a logos culture, they degenerated. And we can see their degeneration in the way that they lost their ability to hold together, and they dissolved into civil wars. They tore themselves to pieces until finally the only way that they could go on was to be conquered by the Macedonians from outside and have the Macedonians prop them up in a new semi-Greek, Hellenistic rather than Hellenic culture. The idea that the things that we think are the highest and the best as moderns were the things that helped the classical Greeks to fall apart. This is what Kenneth Smith's saying here when he says mythos culture is not a degenerate or primitive form of logos culture. Logos culture is not an improvement over mythos culture. Logos culture is strongly aligned with Verstand, the second of these three stages of development. And mythos culture is strongly aligned with Vernunft, the highest stage of human cognitive development, as far as we know so far. So the message he's giving here is exactly the opposite of what our own indoctrination into modernity has prepared us to be able to accept. Phil, then Donald, then Sharon. Go ahead, Phil. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I sort of have a little bone to pick with Hegel. I mean, like, you seem to indicate that, but I'll say it a little bit more affirmative. I love Hegel, so let's put that forward first. But the bone I have to pick with him is the assumption that zeitgeist in its evolution will develop a very firm destiny to its final triumph. And my thought with that is that it's really a triumph of civilization over the cosmos, over nature. Because what it seems to me is like, and to some degree, like the fact that the way we see science, and particularly the science in relationship to technology, has progressed so far, it has completely triumphed over nature. Okay, number one. Number two, the particular segment that resisted that was the artists, in a broad sense, the poets, right? Who said there's something deeper. But in one sense, they have also submitted to civilization in the sense that the notion of aesthetics is embodied in the arts. Like, don't go out in nature to look at beauty. It's in the art gallery, or it's in the poetry. That's also a triumph of civilization. Okay? And if you gather those together, that is the autonomy of civilization asserting itself as somehow superior to nature. And by all means, in some sense, it's true. We have conquered nature. Just go look at all those thousands of fishing boats hauling ass, if you want to call it that way, and those oil wells and all those things, and the fact that all the vertebrates, I should say mammals, 90% of them are domesticated, right? Okay, that we could leave 10% to nature, but we'll soon take over that as well. So the triumph of civilization over nature or the cosmos is something that is perhaps a little bit arrogant. I mean, we desperately need civilization. I'm not talking against civilization, by the way, because civilization, if we suddenly went back to like Neanderthal, well, most of us would be dead. Okay, so we come to a point that its truth is not so much its truth, but that we need it. I mean, it absolutely needs it in order for us to even continue. Because if science fails us to develop new grains or whatever, if you know, particularly when all the Amazon forest is being chopped off, there's going to be less and less beauty and aesthetics in nature. It's like, yeah, we do need the art. So this is really a talk of civilization triumph over nature. And I think, like I said, we depend on it. So that's why living at that city gates is good, because you need it. You need to be in it, but you also need to maintain, if at the very least, and I don't even like those words, the reserve of nature that's there as a supplement to our existence. And I think that once we violate that beyond the tipping point, which we're about to do, then it no longer even serves as a reserve, right? We've used up all the reserves. So I think that's what the fallacy is. And so that's the bone. As much as I love Hegel, that's the bone I have to pick with him, is the triumph of civilization. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. I'm with you. I pick that bone with Hegel all the time. I agree 100%. He is a product of his time, and I think it's really good for our humility to consider that this is the guy who broke with Kant and developed this concept of these stages of developments in the mind and history and culture, and that allowed him to see the defects of reason and the ways that it attaches itself to delusions and ideologies. He sees all that, and yet he himself is still obviously in the grip of a fair number of delusions and ideologies that stand out to a lot of modern readers. You're like, really? You think the Chinese can't have philosophy because you think their writing system is the I Ching? You don't know that they have a whole writing system. You think that these I Ching symbols are the sum total of Chinese writing, and therefore, since you couldn't use I Ching to develop necessarily, a broad sweep of philosophies, that means that the Chinese could. How could you be that deluded? And the answer is, well, he was already convinced of the superiority of European civilization. So it was easy for him to believe that a culture as ancient as China must somehow be completely backwards with regard to its language and writing. He was predisposed to see that, even if it required an enormous distortion in light of his own philosophies. So if the man who comes up with the critique of reason in this sense can himself fall prey to the very problems that he so conspicuously drew attention to without himself noticing that he's falling prey to them, then that's a good warning to the rest of us about what limits and liabilities there were likely to be to our own reason and to our own philosophy. It goes back to why Nietzsche warns us that the great power of philosophy is not to be used in critiquing our enemies. It's to be used in critiquing ourselves, right? That until we achieve the Archimedean standpoint and use the lever of philosophy against our own cherished beliefs, we aren't actually engaging in philosophy. It's just rhetorical tricks. It's sophistry. We've picked up a hammer and we're not building a house. We're just hitting other people over the head with it. And that's the warning to us that, if Hegel can do it, we can do it. So we should be careful. So thank you for picking that bone. Donald, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Oops. Oh, sorry, I just hit mute.
Okay. It seems to me that mythos is a means for capturing arche. You know, in the arche, it somewhat seems are for things that have, I think the Greeks would have said soul, some sort of drive or animation, you know, not just the mechanical particles in motion type thing, something that needs a will. And I was thinking that for our Verstand, it's clearly now differential equations. And in fact, using those differential equations, for some reason, there's been several major physicists have come out and said, well, you know, there is no free will. Well, because there's no will. You know, what you have is these equations that they actually work forward or backward. Given a current state of all the particles, you can calculate the predecessor state or the subsequent state, and you can do that till eternity, you know, or to the end of the universe. And so there can be no will. It's just particles in motion and differential equations. Now, I didn't study differential equations like I should when I was a math major, because as it was explained to me, there really isn't any math in differential equations. It's just tricks for solving equations. There's no theory of differential equations. They're just other equations. But so I'm not very good, but I'm pretty sure that they're just, you know, describe where all the particles are going to be, what their masses, velocity, direction is going to, you know, going to be. And that's a Verstand thing. And that takes out, I mean, I'm not sure that, like the Greeks, for me, that everything is an organism. You know, I think maybe there is a part of the universe that's perfectly described by equations because it hasn't risen to a state where it can willfully will live willfully or persist willfully. But you can certainly see in modernity that modern physics doesn't leave much room there. Anyway, that's enough. And I want to say, Phil and I are growing closer on Plato. I don't know if it's because I sit and listen to him or what, but I think he's right in that Socrates is has a big gnostic element. He wants to explain things by pointing to common experiences that anyone can have, you know, and instead of to ideas that anyone could think, you know, you can explain them. Well, that's enough. I'll let Sharon talk.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah, you know, ultimately, what we did, whether we see the cosmos in a modernist way as a collection of objects arranged into mechanisms that can be described through physics, and deny the possibility of organisms and say an organism is just a complicated machine, or whether we take the Greek perspective and say everything is organisms, you know, even an atom is a kind of organism, albeit a very simple one. In both cases, we're going to have the typical problem that physicists have identified over the centuries, which is our models are better in some places than others. And the more we stretch them to reach into places they weren't designed to model very well, the less well they model things. And so we end up with light being a particle and a wave. And whether you treat it as a particle or as a wave depends on which problem with light you're dealing with. And an attempt to create a unified model that makes complete sense out of light for all circumstances gives us a model that's a little awkward to use everywhere. Nowhere is it really easy to use because all of your boundary cases are being brought out of the boundaries and put right into the center of the model to force you to look at them. So I think this is another example of why what Kenneth Smith's doing in this book is not saying that the ancient perspective is better than the modern perspective, but rather saying that each of these three perspectives has its zone where it does better than the other two. And conversely, it's got other zones where it does worse. And we learn so much by learning about those ranges of accuracy and comparing and contrasting them. So no, Donald's talking about the moderns having the mechanistic mind more than the ancients. So Sharon, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I have a question. I'm trying to understand this. Here you said that the redefinition of mythos has not been primitive or false, as modernity prefers to dismiss it, but it is mature, the very apex of human cognition. That's how the ancients saw it.
Yes.
However, so why did they go on, if it had such authenticity, why did they go on to develop the locus culture and at the same time engage the wisdom of the philosophers? Why was myth unsatisfying or unedifying, whichever one it is?
We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that.
I'm not off base here, am I? It just
No, it's the right question. It's the right question. Once again, you put your finger right on the core question. Why would they do this? Why wouldn't they say, here we are at Mythos, we've arrived, we're done, let's stay here? Why would they move past it and go to Logos?
Yes.
And we're going to explore that. But it's going to take the rest of chapter 4 to get there. But we'll be able to move more swiftly through chapter 4 because we're now at the point of decoding this core idea of mythos. And with this decoded, the rest of the sections in 4 follow very smoothly. It's just getting over the hump of seeing this from the ancient perspective and not the modern perspective that's slowing us down here for a while. But yeah, you're raising the key question of not only of chapter 4, but of why the rest of the book, right? Because it's not just about the Greek sark, but the entire ancient world shifted more towards logos culture and away from mythos culture. And that's what this whole book is about. So it's a great question. It just doesn't have a quick, easy answer. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen. Tell us what's on your mind.
I've been last few weeks having a little bit of a look over that debate Jordan Peterson had with Dillahunty a number of years ago. It seems to have resurfaced a lot on YouTube and all that. And you see Dillahunty, Peterson said to them, well, you're not really atheists, are you? You think you're atheists, but you're not. And poor Dillahunty is just running around like a wet hen with that one. How dare Peterson tell me that I'm not an atheist? And I'm absolutely amazed. Even I can think of this one, that there's a point there when Peterson says that Dillahunty was a practicing Christian when he was a kid. He believed in all the stuff that formed his mind. So if Peterson said that your moral beliefs are on the basis that you're not really an atheist, there was a point in your life when you believed all the stuff. So you weren't born an atheist. He doesn't actually tell Dillahunty that, or when he's talking about other people. And Dillahunty just can't work it out. But yeah, I mean, in my case, I remember when I believed in Santa Claus, or, you know, I still believed in the standard perspective, the Christian religion, and God's looking over my shoulder, making sure I'm not doing anything bad. I remember all that. And amazingly, Dillahunty doesn't. Nietzsche complained that the sickness of the philosophers is they forget history. And his huge accusation against modern thoughts was, yeah, well, it's great, but unfortunately, it's shallow. Now, this might have been his accusation against the type of rationalism which was developing as a tool amongst the Greeks. It's a great little machine. I mean, what had grown up in the Greek society was growing up in the Mediterranean at the time was large-scale commerce relative to what had been occurring before, a money culture. Here you are, here's your money, put all your silver electrum coins in a box. Hey guys, I'm rich, I feel really good about this. Now, of course, people had silver or gold or all this stuff beforehand, but the idea that, yeah, we can put it down to a mathematical value precisely all the time, any moment of the day, I have a mathematical idea of what my wealth is, and I am that. If I've got, 100 silver coins, I am that. So they've lost a little bit there, that it doesn't always quite work out like that. You can have economic problems. People sometimes will bury their hoard of silver when the market's not working too well, which can be for various reasons. And this is the thing, this tool comes along, this new type of rationality, which is built for all the commerce. Got to keep all this, how much cargo is going on that ship, what's coming back, adding it up in their minds. Maybe they're a bit better at doing it in their minds than today. And yeah, and Nietzsche would say, yeah, it's great, oh, it's fantastic, but because it is so easy, you start to become a bit more superficial. When our society is full of the easy, we start to lose the deeper sense that comes from the travail. And this might have been the basis for his condemnation of, as he said, the modern free spirit, the modern intellectual, who, to be an intellectual, has so many advantages. You can watch YouTube, read a book, go and do a little course if they like. It's Plato's at your fingertips. You don't even have to go down to a musty old library anymore and soak in that magnificent atmosphere of musty books. I need to develop the spray can that just spreads that perfume so you can have the full experience of it all again. But the other question is, can you have everything? Can you be everyone? And this strange little animal organism called humanity thinks that ultimately they can have everything at one moment, that they can be everyone at one moment. No, to acquire one sensation of being and ideas and to have different drives, I have to change. I have to lose the person I was in the past a bit. I can remember that person a little bit, but I'm losing it. If I'm the person who's like the doulos, who's just happy-go-lucky, who's just wandering along looking for a good master, what a blessed state of being. I was like that once. And then pain in my life caused me to think more and think more carefully. And I started to lose that stage of being in the happy childhood bubble at an extended age, which a lot of people are in. Ignorance is bliss. It's a great place to be. But I'm just this simple animal organism called, humanity, and I'm not a god. I can't do it all. I'm even dependent on other people. I can't become an expert violinist, even if I had the talent. I might not have the time. I have to depend on somebody else spending all their time on it. But people get this crazy idea they can have it all without losing anything of anything else. And yes, this seems to be the problem, that we get all these devices without realizing. It's like Laura Ingalls in Little House on the Prairie is pointing out that all this technology came along in her life, but it came at a price. So the question of the modern intellectual who has become superficial, as Nietzsche said, they've overlooked everything. They've overlooked the depth that history teaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, there's the problem of finitude here, which is we may fantasize about knowing everything and doing everything and being everyone, but we still only have 24 hours in a day, a fair percentage of which we have to spend asleep. So we can't know everything or do everything or be everyone. Even the things that we learned as a child, if we don't practice them anymore, they decay. I was more fluent in Spanish at age 13 than I am today. I've been retaking lessons for 2 years online through Duolingo, and it's helped restore some of it, but I'm still not at the level of proficiency I used to be at when I was younger. And that's because I don't have time for it. Even if I set aside some time every day to practice, it's not the same as speaking with my Spanish speaking friends every day like I did when I was a teenager. That kept it fresh and kept me immersed in it and kept it good. But ever since I moved into work environments where I'm not working directly with people who primarily speak Spanish, and I'm not living primarily with people who speak Spanish, my Spanish has gotten rusty. I can't both be good at the things I'm good at now and good at the things that I'm not practicing now. And that's hard for the modern ego to accept. We want to, like you say, Stephen, we want to think we can have it all and do it all and be it all. And the finitude, this is one of the things that mythos cultures are better at getting people to understand than logos cultures are. So logos cultures, Verstand is more abstract. Bye, Ginny. It's good to see you. Verstand is more abstract than Begriff by its very nature. This is the point Hegel makes over and over about the difference between the two. And once you begin abstracting from reality, you begin losing touch with reality. The realm of ideas is all full of beautiful theorems that don't actually apply in the real world. There's a way in which we become ungrounded, and it's easy to lose track of the most important essential truths, such as our own finitude and the limitations that imposes upon us. This is one of the things that happens in the shift from a mythos culture to a logos culture. And for Sharon's benefit, we will come back to this question over and over in every session. Why does this shift happen? How does this shift happen? Why would somebody do something like this? But part of it is that noesis, like gnosis, is a kind of trap for us. Once you start to lean into it, it sucks you in. It's an organism of thinking and culture, and it wants you to use it It wants to be used, and it wants to do the interpreting of the world for you. And the more you let it interpret the world for you, the more it convinces you that the previous stage of development was a bad stage and you should stay out of it. You should be glad that you left it. You're better now. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's when we bring in more Kierkegaard, which we'll do later on in the months and years ahead. This was one of Kierkegaard's areas of specialization, was the study of the structure of delusion. How is it that we create these circular arguments for ourselves that become traps? Logos culture, because it's founded in Verstand, is that kind of trap, in which it seems by its own metrics to be the best possible way to be. And therefore, anything that you lose in the transition is erased by Verstand and becomes a non-thing. All the virtues become ascribed to your new way of life, and all the vices to your old way of life. And thus you're seduced into the next stage of development. Phil, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I wanted to address Sharon's question. And of course, it's going to be incomplete. I kind of think it comes down to a couple of things. The relationship between a question and an answer. And the relationship of what is coherent to the question and what is comprehensive to the question. The problem is we have a finite mind in an infinite universe, or at least a very large universe. Let's put it that way. Maybe I should say infinite. And the problem is that when you ask a question, it almost always cannot be comprehensive. It could be coherent, like, yes, it applies to a certain situation or circumstance. And it's frustrating to ask a question and you just say, I don't know. Right? I mean, like, maybe for an artist, that's okay. But if you're a medical person, it's like, well, you got to do something, but I don't know what to do. Like, I have more questions to ask. And so we're compelled to act. And so therefore, there's very appealing something that has an answer, because you could act upon it, right? And we're compelled to act. And if you could act on it, even if it's like a little bit uncertain, you still have to act. Otherwise, the person's going to die, right? You have a very tough choice. And so therefore, and you're at the doctor and he said, oh, no, you got a serious problem. We got to do this and this, and this may result in death. As a safety clause. And he said, well, how certain are you? He said, I will bet your life on it. He said, well, how about your own life? I mean, what if a doctor actually was going to do something, and actually, if they did it wrong, they're put to death? I mean, they can't do it. So now I know that you're a little uncertain about the postmodernists, and so am I. But I listened to something by Derrida, and I'm sure you don't like Derrida, but there's something kind of important, what he said about difference, spelled slightly differently from difference. Difference is like allowing different attitudes, different opinions, because none of us are certain. That's good. But the difference, there's a second meaning in difference, which is deferral. In other words, we have a question, we have a partial answer, but that answer is incomplete. I will defer that to others to give me their opinion. But not only that, deference is also, I will defer the incompleteness to the future. So ambiguity is no longer just ambiguity, it's deferring further investigation and further understanding and further exploration. So to retain difference is not only to permit a spreading of others' opinions, but also to defer that the moment you're in, you have to act and do something, but it's incomplete. So you are leaving part of it to a future to clarify. So the deferring is an important thing. Now, the problem I have with it is he's concentrating on the text rather than the world, right? And that becomes like the deferring to a further opinion of the court, so to speak. So, but I like that difference, right? Because it doesn't obliterate another opinion from another person, right? So you're just wrong. Like, get out of here, get out of my sight, right? You say, oh, you know, maybe you got something to say, but you know, like, but I have to act now. And difference, yes, the future always have something to say about what we are doing now, as we have something to say about what the Greeks are doing. So deferring seems like, well, you know, you're not taking, you know, control of the situation. No, that's actually allowing others at a later period to give a more complete answer. So I like the deference more than I even like the difference.
That's interesting. Thanks, Phil. That's interesting. All right, so I'm going to share. I wrote some text kind of to prepare for getting us over the hump in section F, and I quoted one of my sentences up above on that. This thing about the redefinition of mythos. So I'm gonna throw some more in at you, and we'll talk our way through it. So this issue of moderns being predisposed to see the mythos as a primitive or false stage that leads to the logos, and that the idea that the ancient perspective doesn't see it that way, that the ancient perspective sees mythos as a more sophisticated stage of human development than logos, that these are irreconcilable worldviews. And when we've talked before about this idea that although you can't pin down any one year where one epoch ends and another begins, from the center of the bell curve of one epoch to the center of the bell curve of the next epoch, if you compare their worldviews, you can see that they've not just changed, but they've changed, as Hegel insists, in ways that directly negate some of the core values of the previous epoch. I mean, a direct rejection, so that they become incompatible with each other. And we don't really understand them until we understand those incompatibilities. So the reason I'm harping on this logos mythos issue right here in the middle of his chapter 4 is because this is one of these key ideas where the modern interpretation is most antagonistic to the ancient interpretation. So antagonistic, we almost can't understand why anybody would say what they said. It seems inconceivable to us. So as part of that, you know, this idea that the mythos could be superior to the logos is like claiming that the irrational is superior to the rational. We know that can't be true. We know it can't, because irrationality is the absence of rationality. Why would the lack of a faculty be better than the faculty? That makes no sense to us, right? The terms have predisposed us to interpret the relationship between gnosis and noesis as irrationality versus rationality. And there's two problems with that. The first is it's asserting there's nothing positive to gnosis, only an absence of noesis. And the second is it's asserting that we have to pick. It's imposing the law of the excluded middle and saying one or the other, but never both. Could not possibly be both. You must be one. And so you have to pick the good one. Why would you pick the bad one? And when you look at it this way, you can see how the modern interpretation of the structure of rationality and its relationship to irrationality predisposes its own answer. It actually makes it impossible in modern terms to embrace what modernity calls irrationality in any way other than just trying to be a troublemaker or being crazy. You'd have to be crazy to want to be irrational. or maybe you're just trying to stir up an argument. But there can't be a legitimate argument in favor of irrationality over rationality. Not to us, not the way we've predefined things. We already set the answer we wanted to arrive at by the way we asked the question. And it's this kind of unconscious framing that is part of the immune system of an epoch or a worldview. That's how it protects itself. People are very easy to trick by framing. How you frame a question determines what kinds of answers it's possible to produce. And if you frame it properly, other questions can't be asked at all. So if we say, how much of human thinking needs and is dependent upon irrationality versus how much of human thinking needs and is dependent upon rationality, it sounds like a contradiction in terms. That's a non-question. But if we borrow these Greek terms and we say how much of human thinking is dependent on gnosis versus how much is dependent on noesis, we have escaped the frame, right? Because now we're not prejudging the answer. Each one has its own equally valid name. Neither is defined as being the bad one or the absence of the other. And further, they're not defined as being mutually exclusive, which is the critical difference between this set of terms and the terms rationality and irrationality, right? We don't have to choose one if we're offered gnosis and noesis. We could say, well, they both sound interesting. Can't we have both? To which the answer is, yes, you, ding, 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 you win the prize. Let's have both. But if you offer the prize, would you rather have rationality or irrationality? We're in trouble. We can't answer it in a healthy way. We're trapped. We've been trapped. And you see this is obvious in the case of something like irrationality versus rationality. It's subtler in the case of mythos versus logos. We only realize that the same law of the excluded middle, the same scapegoating of the past for being primitive and superstitious and having all our vices, and exalting of the future as being progress and having all our virtues, we don't entirely see that that's what's happening. Now, when we say that the culture transitioned from mythos to logos over time, the modern concept of time is itself where we're got our thumbs on the scale and are building in the presupposition that one of them is the bad inferior thing and the other is the better superior newer thing. And so why would you ever choose the bad one? We assume that mythos to logos must be an improvement because logos came after mythos, and time improves things. Things develop. There's a great march of progress until someday we shall surely be like the gods, the modern presupposition. But if we didn't know that the Greeks went through a transition where they started out in mythos and then developed logos, if the terms were just given to us from scratch, if we hadn't already predefined myth as being a lie or a tall tale, then we might be able to treat them the way that we treat gnosis and noesis and say, well, here are two interesting ideas. Wouldn't it be nice to have both of them? And we might even be open to the idea that there was a third one and that the real dichotomy is between that third one and logos, and that mythos is the synthesis of logos and that third other thing, which represents gnosis. We would be open to those ideas if the terms hadn't already, before we began the discussion, been predefined in order to rule it out as a possibility. So I'm going to pause there. Sharon, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I'm just thinking that you just mentioned about framing. I think in all these entities, even the personality types, I don't see them as discrete. I see sometimes a civilization, the ancients, they operate in mythos, depending on the subject matter, and then they go to logos. So it's never, the way I visualize it, it's never ever complete. And I don't think any one individual is noesis. Yeah, your personality type, you wax in and out of personality types depending on the situation. You have an essential character, but you have a lot of operative entities, operative parts of it. And I think that's the same way our culture operates. And you may have predominantly mythos at one point in time, just depend on the subject matter. And then you shift to logos for another area. So I guess that's the question I'm asking. It's never complete. It's never discrete. It always goes back and forth.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. That's the, you know, one of the big differences between existentialist philosophy and what Kenneth would call escapist philosophy is escapist philosophy wants to tell you that the framework for defining and categorizing things is God's own truth, and you can't question it. Whereas a more scientific approach says these are just models, and in nature we're always going to find mixtures. We're never going to find the pure thing by itself obeying exactly according to the model. So I'm with you, Sharon. I'm with you. And you know, the main correction that I'd make is that, you know, Kenneth has given us the terms mythos and logos, but he hasn't given us the third term. And whatever the third term is, that's the thing that's actually in opposition to logos. Mythos is the synthesis of the two, logos and whatever that third thing is that we could make a term for. And I think part of the reason that he leaves out the third term is, I believe he's argued before, and Donald can tell me if I'm right about this, that if a group of people consist only of douloi, they're not capable of producing culture. Culture requires higher stages of development than naive gnosis. And so we can't say X culture the way we can say logos culture or mythos culture, because douloi by themselves, they're too appetitive and immersive and experiential. Culture is what happens when we grow beyond that. It's what we build above that. So the idea would be that long before the Greeks had mythos culture, they had earlier stages of development. And those are lost to history. They were just an oral culture back then. They didn't document what those were. We're probably never going to know. You know, we can use archaeology and linguistics and genetics to sort of sketch a little bit what the prehistory of the Greeks was like and what kinds of cultures they might have had. And it would have told us an enormous amount if we could have known, if it had been documented. But I think, like we were talking about 2 years ago, there's a way in which, as the argument is made in the book The Alphabet and the Goddess, there's a way in which writing itself is a logos activity. You have to be interested in linearizing communication in order to develop writing. And the moment you do that, you know, the moment you're capable of doing that is a moment in which you have already made a pretty strong transition in the direction of logos culture. So it may be that it's not possible to have really documented those earlier stages of culture because they were, by definition, pre-writing. But in any case, looking in general at the problem, you know, we can sort of see how the ancient perspective and the modern perspective, even in us right here contemplating these words and ideas, it's uncomfortable. There's a tug of war going on between us, between these two interpretive frameworks, for which one gets to win, which one gets to say what mythos really means. I mean, is a myth really a tall tale and fable? Is it really a persuasive way of explaining arche in ways that human beings need, or else we'll all collapse? Is it something else? Now, these interpretive frameworks are pulling on these words, and they kind of don't want to let us equivocate between them. They don't want to let us possess both definitions in our toolbox and be able to move back and forth between them. There is a totalitarianizing drive in a worldview that makes it want to drive out alternatives and establish itself as the one true worldview that your mind will inhabit. And so what he's asking us to do in this book is very contranatural. It's hard for us. And we feel the struggle right here on this term myth. It's a really good term for this. It's so hard not to say the myth of the self-made man, for example, you know, or the myth of the invisible hand of the marketplace. And then that term is so important to modernity when it's used in that sense, that it's hard to say, what if we temporarily don't use the word that way and we use it this other way? And our brain kind of keeps wanting to shift back to the one that we're good at, that we've reflexively gotten good at. So, but if we explore this idea further, kind of what I was writing in the text that I shared above, you see that there is this way in which the totalitarianizing impulse of a worldview, the way that it wants to become an enclosure, an envelope for our mind, and stand between us and all of the evidence of the world, it causes a kind of polarization, a scapegoating, in which all the vices must be pushed onto the other and all the virtues pulled onto the self. The worldview wants to attribute, as part of making us dependent on it, it wants to attribute every virtue of thinking to its distinctive mode of thinking. Even the things that it's not good at, it wants to claim credit for. Because those things are good and you want them, and it wants you to want it. So it claims, oh, I'm the source of that. So if you want that, you have to have me. And conversely, it doesn't want to take credit, or should I say responsibility, for all of its vices, for all the things it does wrong, because you don't want the negative consequences, and it wants to prevent you from not wanting it. So it refuses to acknowledge that it's the source of the bad things that it creates. And in order for that to work, it needs a scapegoat that it can demonize as the source of all those vices. And so this is how the pole between rationality and irrationality gets set up by modernity. So the irrationality, by its very definition, sounds like a plausible source of chaos, loss of control, violence, subjectivity, all the vices can be pushed onto irrationality. And then rationality can take credit for everything that's good, including the very things that it is most conspicuously bad at. So like science was invented to tether reason. Science was invented to put reason to the test, because reason is constantly generating persuasive bullshit. We're constantly concluding logically things that are valid but false because of the contamination of our premises. And logic offers us no way to critique our premises, nor to critique whether we stopped at the right conclusions, or maybe we should have stopped sooner, or maybe we should have gone further. Reason has nothing to offer us on that front, but it doesn't want to admit that it has these problems, right? Because then you might not want it. This is where the object or mechanic model of the world really fails to explain the role that ideas play in the human mind, or worldviews, or cultures. Because the mechanical model of the mind makes you think that your mind has all the control, and that it is an instrument of your will. It's voluntary. It does what you want it to do. It's you, right? So why wouldn't it do what you want it to do? Descartes tells us it's ours. So if it's ours and ideas are its possessions, then there are possessions, and we can pick them up and put them down like a hammer, and they shouldn't change us. They shouldn't control us. They shouldn't distort our understanding of reality. From the modern perspective, these are not possible ideas. And because they're not possible ideas, it means that we enter the con game of an ideology predisposed to trust the con artist. We trust modernity to tell us truthfully how we work and how it works. The very idea of questioning modernity skeptically, questioning our own minds skeptically, questioning reason itself, and saying, what are the vices of reason that reason is trying to hide from us? This is almost inexpressible in modern terms. Reason, from a modern perspective, can't try to hide things from us, because reason is a perfect, pure, objective lens for seeing the truth. Its purpose is not to hide things. So it can't be doing anything wrong. And that means if reason tells us that irrationality is where all bad things come from, we are predisposed to believe it. And having bought into that like in kindergarten or earlier, before we had any critical faculties to speak of. At this point in our lives, it becomes very hard to turn the pages of the book that far back and start asking questions about the premises on which we've built our entire worldview through the rest of our lives. That's how a worldview gets you. It doesn't get you by persuading you logically with all the facts, all the cards on the table to make the best choice. It persuades you by pre-establishing the definitions of things and the framing of questions and the assumptions and what should we pay attention to and what should we not pay attention to, until by the time it's done stacking the deck, we have no chance against it. Right? The house wins. The house always wins. The only way to beat the house is to get out of the house and look at it from the outside and see all the people who walk in with money and walk out without money. And only then do we start to clue in, oh, there's a larger pattern here that we were trapped in that we couldn't see as long as we were inside the pattern. Thus the labyrinth metaphor, right? Daedalus in the labyrinth of his own construction. Phil, go ahead, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I have a question that comes out of that. Is like, to what degree should there be tolerance for other view? Obviously, if there's no tolerance at all, then it's a totalizing authoritarian structure. And that shouldn't be tolerated. Okay. But on the other hand, like, there's kind of a balance, but because if you're tolerant of everything, absolutely everything, then the structure of your culture, your civilization dissolves into conflict, become balkanized, I want to call it that way. Like everybody wants their own thing and you split up into little groups. So how do you achieve that balance? It seems to me like, even in a democracy, we know what happened in Athens. In some ways it was too democratic, so it was vulnerable to demagoguery. Is that the right term? Like people who convince you this and that, and it went into chaos because, and fell under the sways of some figure that is very good at rallying things, well, such as Hitler, or Pericles. And so there seems to be a balance. And I think Hegel, to a certain degree, hinted at that, in the sense you never negate anything, but you sublate it. Sublate it means that you allow it to exist, but not to the point that it becomes so entrenched that it allows it to become a destructive to the particular culture or civilization as such. And what that does is allows it to evolve in a way that is, I'll not say rational, but reasonable. That's manageable in some sense. We have that. We certainly have that problem now. We thought, oh yeah, we're a very tolerant society. We except we never really did, but let's presume that we did. And that January 6th pretty much showed that maybe we've gone too far, because people have been persuaded, like, to save our country, we have to overthrow it, that sort of thing. Okay, yeah. So I think that's a very tricky and deep question, because I surely want to believe in tolerance, but there is a point which I do not tolerate certain situations. So I think that's a tricky issue to answer. Like, is it 70%? Is it 60%? Is it 50%? I mean, certainly if you got down to like 30% or 20%, you're in a lot of trouble, right? I mean, the center cannot hold. And you always have to deal with how can the center hold, and yet you have the peripheries are satisfied enough, and they could exist in a comfortable way. That's a difficult question, because the civilization wants to save itself, right? Until it can no longer save itself. And quite often, people always say the trouble is always never from without, but from within. Rome did not fall because the barbarians kept attacking. That has something to do with it. But it sort of fell because the inside can no longer agree with what the inside should be. And so, yeah, so culture want to exist too, continue to exist, and but on the other hand, it become totalizing. There's no room for choice, right? I guess you could get out, go live in Japan or somewhere, or whatever, But the world has become it's beginning to be a little totalizing itself. So it becomes even a problem to find a place. Unless you're very, very rich, maybe you could, buy a desert island, and it's like, do whatever you're going to do. All right, that's it. It's a question, because there is a desire to preserve the context and to allow for enough criticism that it could evolve. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, because the two extremes seem to be wrong. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I mean, effectively, you've restated in an interesting way what Aristotle says in the Politics, when he says there's the good democracy and there's the bad democracy. And if all you have is a bunch of people voting and whatever gets the majority opinion, you do that, then you have one of the worst forms of government possible. But if you have a bunch of people who share certain principles and virtues, who share certain goals and objectives, then democracy can be one of the best of all forms of government, because their voting is aligned on purpose. The bad form of democracy is 10 lions and a zebra voting on what to have for lunch. Nothing productive for the zebra is going to come out of this vote. And all the other bad variants, that Aristotle talks about are some version of this. There's two solutions to the problem, but they both result in complicated consequences that are hard to sum up. It's easier to sum up one man, one vote than it is to sum up the other two ideas. And the other two ideas are, on most issues, it would be better if you never had a vote. Right? I mean, the point where you get to the vote is the point at which everybody's in everybody else's business. If you need brain surgery, your brain surgery is not improved by having the population of the United States vote cut by cut on what the brain surgeon ought to do to your brain. Nothing gets better by introducing a vote into that process. That's the last thing in the world you want. All the bored trolls, who are looking for something horrible to happen, are all going to vote in favor of you getting killed in some spectacular, flashy way, because that might, alleviate the tedium of their afternoon. They're not voting for the reason you want them to be voting. So, rule number one is trying to disentangle things so that fewer things require votes. After all, what is a vote? Why should a vote even be involved in your brain surgery? I mean, once you, your family, and the brain surgeon have established what you want to do, what advantage is there to introducing, hundreds of millions of other people into the decision? The answer is nothing. Most decisions are made better if they're decentralized. They're localized to just the people they directly affect. So that's one principle, is to fix that. Hierarchies concentrate power, and power makes stupid, as Nietzsche says. It's you want to decentralize these things and concentrate them where they belong, which is you, your family, and your brain surgeon. These are the people who ought to have concentrated authority, not all these other people who feel like, for the principle of the thing, they ought to have a say, or because they don't like you, they want to have a say, or what have you. The other thing is, as related to that, is people's lives can be disentangled so that they can live orthogonally to each other, so that they coexist and they contribute where it's easy to contribute. But where they disagree, if the disagreements don't directly affect each other, you don't have to bring them together into a vote and force them to collide with each other. You can separate them and say, even if the decision you made for your brain surgery is not the decision that somebody else would have made, it doesn't matter. We've separated, the spheres, if you will, in order to let our lives be more orthogonal. And if you do that, then large-scale structure can emerge more organically, so that the people who align with each other can work together more than the people who don't align with each other. They don't have to get into a direct conflict unless there's a real conflict. You don't have to artificially generate conflicts by forcing everything to a vote the way that we do in a democracy. I see you want to add something, Phil. You came off mute.
Yeah, I just want to add, which is what's his name now? Let's see. Oh God, I forgot his name. Ishi, the American Indian, the last California Indian of his tribe. And of course, I was always very sympathetic and empathetic to Ishi, because imagine the burden he lived under. He knew his culture is going to die. Only thing left is the memory of it, and so he's busy making stuff to instantiate itself. At least it lives in the museum. And so I was just so impressed by that story when somebody came over for tea, and he knew enough about modern civilization to know how to operate a stove and all that kind of stuff. That's right. But he always heated up a stone that was hot and then drop it into water and then make tea from there. And I said, God, here's something I more than tolerate his thing. I really honor the fact that he was loyal enough to his civilization to not do the quote right thing. But he did the wrong thing, right? Because that's what his mom taught him, and that's how he's going to honor his tradition, right? I think if we have the tolerance for allowing that sort of thing, that's perfectly fine. He didn't require that everybody heat up a stone and put it in a glass of water and make tea. He just did it his way, and it didn't hurt anybody, except he was honoring what precious little time he has to communicate, to commune with his tradition and his people, and it's going to soon be gone. And I think this is the kind of thing, that kind of tolerance, I will abide by every day, right? It's like, instead of no, turn them into American Indian school and teach them to be white people. That's a little far, okay? So I just think that, yeah, that sort of tolerance is fine. It's just when they begin to, let's say, assert, no, do it our way, or get out of town, it's like, no, that's a little different. So I just want to add that part, because we all live within a certain multiple dimensions of our existence, and we should allow that to persist to the degree that we want it to. All right, that's it.
Thanks, Phil. So back to the text. So this issue that reason itself is not a flawless lens. In fact, it's not any kind of lens, that it is an organism and it wants you to use it. It wants to seduce you into using it, and it wants to seduce you into thinking that it is sufficient and that the other faculty of the mind is a bad one. In fact, it's a non-faculty, it's non-reason, it's irrationality. And in fact, it wants to seduce you into thinking that reason doesn't do anything bad. Every single bad thing that ever happens is the fault of irrationality. And we're going to, and now we can all compete with each other in the social, political, and economic hierarchy for who's the most rational, and, who's getting, oh, don't get emotional now. Don't get subjective. I want an objective assessment, like the kind that I deliver because I am an angel of reason. All of these kinds of mockable, cliched behaviors are familiar to us because this is actually how our society is structured. This is the game we have to play in modernity. And we have to play it because rationality likes this game. This is the game rationality wants. Now, you'd think, how can a game like this be defended on rational terms? And when you start asking this question is when you finally start to understand what reason actually is, which is reason is not reason. In the terms that reason uses to define itself, it is not what it is. It's something else. Its own definition can't account for its behavior. It accounts for the behavior by hiding a lot of it, right? It takes credit for the behavior of a different faculty whenever it's good. And it refuses to take credit for the behavior of itself whenever it's bad. So in all of this distortion, none of this could be possible if reason were reason in the sense that we understand it, which means that the term reason itself is part of the problem. It prevents us from understanding what this faculty is in us. It's the advantage of switching to the jargon of noesis. We don't have this strong emotional attachment to noesis. We're willing to look at it more objectively. We don't feel like we have to put our thumbs on the scale to try to defend noesis from criticism because we have no emotional attachment to noesis as a term. So we're willing to admit things about noesis that we wouldn't be willing to admit about reason, even though the faculty that reason claims to be may actually be noesis. And if we do that, then correspondingly, we may be willing to give a more fair shake to the other faculty when we stop calling it irrationality and start calling it gnosis. Then the terms are not prejudging the answer for us, and we can start to look at gnosis and noesis on equal terms. This isn't just a personal issue. It's not just a personal problem. It's not just navel gazing and twiddling our thumbs. It comes down to these bigger problems like a highly hypernoetic civilization like modernity. It doesn't want to take credit for all the bad things that it has caused. It wants to blame those on the past, where it equates the past with irrationality. That is, it wants to blame the other faculty, the one that's, the bad one, the scapegoat that's on the outs. And so every time we rationally conclude that what we should do is enslave people from all over the world to serve us in our industrial factories so that, we don't have to labor as much and we can be more productive, we may have the best logical arguments in the world in favor of that. And that may have justified what we did in our minds. But later, when we're ashamed of it, our commitment to reason is so much stronger than our commitment to justice that rather than honestly saying that our reason got us into this mess and was a contributor, we insist that that was irrational behavior, not rational behavior. That people engaged in slavery for bad reasons because they're irrational people. And furthermore, that entire period of our history will move the goalposts of history and say, furthermore, that wasn't even the modern epoch. Now, back when we were proud of it, we called it the modern epoch. But now that we're ashamed of it, we're going to move the goalposts of the definition. We're going to recategorize history in order to exclude the sins and push them onto the past. Literally push them onto the past, defined as the other side of the boundary, just by moving the boundary. And we do that over and over. We do it with genocide, we do it with ecocide, cetacecide, the emptying of the oceans, all of these things that we've done for rational reasons as modern people. Now that we're ashamed of it, we redefine it as having been caused by irrational reasons. And we say it's not modernity. Modernity is a shrinking period of history in which it keeps shrinking to the point that there's nothing in it that we're ashamed of. And as such, you can see the way in which the thumbs are right on the scales, pushing hard, distorting the entire picture, as even distorting it almost 100%, shrinking down the modern era to just the current year, or the last 10 years, or whatever we're not ashamed of, and saying everything before that wasn't modern. That's a nearly 100% corruption in our acknowledgement of our responsibilities and what we've done. And yet, and this is the critical part, we do it without noticing that we're doing it. We don't do it because we rationally conclude that it would be inconvenient for us to be blamed for things, and therefore let's suppress the memory of this and let's redefine the terms to move things out of our sphere of responsibility. We do it without even noticing that we did it, because rationality is incredibly fluent and proficient at this game of categories and definitions. That's its strong suit, right? It's not just logic. It's the foreground, background work. What are we aware of? What are we not aware of? How do we define things? How do we not define things? Where do we draw the lines? It's so good at, it's like breathing. Not entirely conscious, not entirely unconscious. We can breathe consciously when we want to, and then we take credit for it and say, behold, the power of the mind to make us, the conscious mind to make us breathe. I have rationally decided to breathe. But then we fall asleep and our conscious mind isn't involved anymore, and the breathing continues without us, without our permission. That's how reason is in us. Reason does its work with or without our permission, with or without our awareness. And as such, the levels of distortion that it can cause without us even noticing are spectacular. If reason were what reason claims reason is, reason would be incapable of nearly 100% distorting the picture without noticing that it did it. Ergo, reason and rationality are terrible terms to describe this faculty of the mind. Terrible unless the purpose of the terms is to reinforce the current worldview and epoch and prevent us from questioning it. Then they're great terms because they make it very hard to ask the most important questions. Donald and then Phil. Go ahead, Donald. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Somewhere, a long time ago in my memory, but you could probably find it, your favorite evolutionary biologist, Stephen Jay Gould, has a little essay, I think, or it's part of a larger one, on how do we know things? How do we know things in biology? And one of the first things he points out is that the scientific method, those 5 steps or 7 steps or whatever they are that everybody gets in school, are not themselves the result of a scientific methodology, whatever. They're just pulled out of wherever and say, we follow this, everything will be good. And then he goes on to talk about how in each case, rather more like Aristotle, you have to sort of examine the phenomena to see what rules of inference might hold. To what can, since you can't run experiments, you can't rerun experiments, what deductions might be valid in this? And then he, I think, sort of points out that, all of biology, evolutionary and otherwise, has a real problem. They only have one sample of life evolving. They have no way of deciding what is essential and what is peripheral or superfluous. And so I don't know, I was very impressed with it. It's sort of like, every field in science should have some body somewhere that writes such an essay that says, how can we know what rules of inference might be valid in this domain? Why would we agree to accept them? And realizing that this is sort of not part of the field necessarily, but it's an epistemological study that scientists generally don't undergo. They just pick up their habits from their professors and keep marching.
Thanks, Donald. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me. It's this epistemology is one of, this is no news to you guys. Epistemology is one of my favorite disciplines in philosophy because it's so rich. There's so many questions to be asked, again, not in the interest of navel gazing, but in order to try to get a deeper understanding of why we're in the mess we are in the world that we've created. That it comes directly from, among other things, how we decide what's true and what's not true. Issues of all kinds of complicated political issues become a whole lot more interesting when they're expressed in an epistemological light. This is a recurring theme here, but mythos and logos is all about this. How do we know what we know? How do we pass on ways of learning to the next generation within our culture? Who do we empower with that education to do that education for us? And who do we not? Who helps us to interpret reality and who should not? These are the questions that, mythos versus logos is grappling with. And it directly challenges the core foundations of the modern epoch in ways that the previous sections A through E didn't do. I mean, they raised interesting questions, no doubt, but this one is directly attacking the thing that modernity is proudest of and saying, you are not actually doing what you say you're doing. And you are not who you think you are. That's a level of critique modernity really can't handle. So we'll dig more into this in a moment, but first Phil and then Joseph. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I have 2 points, and because Donald brought up this point. I was in a meeting with Kant on Kant, and there was a guy that asked a question, of who's running it, who pretend to be Kant, and he asked, like, what color do you see? And of course, Kant says, I see pink. And the guy said, well, God, that's kind of funny because I see blue, kind of a light blue, right? And so Kant said, well, you must be wrong because it's pink. And so the guy says, Mr. Kant, could you take off your rose-colored glasses and tell me what color it is? So it's deeper than thought, right? And of course, Kant says, I can't take off my rose-colored glasses. I am trapped in my rose-colored glasses. So right there, Kant has admitted he can't have access to the real world, right? Because he always have the rose-colored glasses on. So that was a very funny question. Like, how do you know what the hell you know when you got rose-colored glasses? And we all do, in a sense. So we're trapped in this interior. Of course, that's a kind of irony. I'm doing my best, even though I'm trapped in my rose-colored glasses. But that's why I can't see blue, light blue. The other question I want to ask, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I'm glad that Kant, admitted there's another dimension. The other question I have to ask is like, and I'll tell a myth. The myth is Pandora's box, right? We know this is a lie because there was no Pandora's box, right? That is a myth, right? But the truth of the myth is that after Robert Oppenheimer exploded the atomic bomb, that myth came alive, right? In other words, there is something within our human structure, our human mind, that wants to know, and wants to know desperately, that we only know when it's bad after the Pandora box has been opened. I said, oh my God. And Robert Oppenheimer was very, very enthusiastic and say, oh no, that what I did was wrong, He didn't say, maybe we shouldn't do this, And you could maybe make the argument, well, if I don't do this, the Nazis going to do it first anyway. So, we got to do it. So you could have a practical argument in that regard, but the Nazi was already defeated. So yeah, but we needed to drop on Tokyo, not Tokyo, but whatever.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Hiroshima, yeah, Hiroshima. So in some sense, it's like, is there a wisdom that we should consider the Pandora's box as a bearer of some degree of truth? In other words, should there be something that we should not even know because it just caused a lot of trouble? I mean, I think that the Greeks sort of understood that, at least to some degree, because they didn't want anybody to defile the dead body of a human being, right? So Galen had to like operate on pigs and all sorts of other things to get an inference of what the human anatomy was like, which is, of course, quite a lot of false stuff. But nonetheless, I think that honoring of the human life, in some sense, in a way, is physically related to Kant, like honor the spirit of the other, right? The dignity of the other, in some sense. So I wonder whether, like I said, the lie, which is the Pandora's box, maybe is telling some degree of truth of something that, in some sense, well, no, come on, that's just a lie. There was never a Pandora's box, and you would be right. So, but there, it does bear some truth, and that's important to know. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, it's that thing when a modern critiques a myth, we have a gift for missing the point. We will say, we'll find some literal part of the myth that's false and say, see, they're trying to explain that. And they did a bad job because now we know it's from this. So therefore the myth is false. And we'll completely miss the picture that it was a metaphor, first of all, right? Metaphors have no obligation to be quantitatively accurate. That's not their job. Their job is to be the finger pointing to the moon. So here's this myth, and it might point us at something that's critically important for the survival of civilization. And we still get hung up about whether that's really where goats come from. We're like, now we know goats don't come from there, so the myth is bullshit. And meanwhile, we're busy nuking our own world, and doing these incredibly stupid things that if we listened to the myth, we wouldn't be doing. And so the question is, the balance of truth and falsehood in the structure of the metaphor may be such that the importance of the truth that was conveyed vastly overwhelms the significance of the falsehood, especially if it's designed for an audience that should understand that the falsehood is false and not to pay it any attention. We instead are predisposed through our objectivity to disregard the larger significance and focus in on the thing that can be numerically measured and accuse it of being false and therefore throw out the entire myth. And in this way, we fail to understand what we're talking about. The other thing is, having bought into the idea that a myth is this kind of falsehood, we then reinforce it by running around finding every tall tale we can and using them as examples of myths, whether they were or not, right? So Paul Bunyan, that was never created for mythic purposes. That was just a tall tale. But when we're busy proving that myths are falsehoods, we'll chuck Paul Bunyan in there and Aesop's fables and anything else we can get our hands on, because we don't really care what a myth really is. We just care about winning the argument. The argument being myths are bad and facts are good, and we're the best and the brightest. So this cherry picking thing that the rational mind does with evidence is just, it's astonishing that we can do it while not paying any attention at all to what we're doing and insisting that we're, our thumb can be pushing the scale all the way down while insisting the whole time, what? Our thumb's not on the scale. Look for yourself. You can see that my thumb's not on the scale while it is. It's an astonishing feat of awareness and lack of awareness. Nescience, I've talked about this before. Kenneth Smith uses the term nescience for that ability to erase from our perception the things that we don't want to acknowledge and create lacunae, gaps in the text of reality. And through selective creation of gaps, we create a worldview that seems to reinforce itself while never noticing we did any of that. Joseph and then Stephen. Go ahead, Joseph. Come off mute.
I'll be brief. One of the things that actually, strikes me about what we've been talking about for a long time now is, with mythos culture, I kind of get the impression that it discounts philosophy altogether. And the reason I say that is you're no longer examining your beliefs. You're no longer, thinking about it in terms of, when you think of things only in terms of facts, of what you're defaulting to those facts as opposed to actually thinking about those facts. And that, that is a I mean, I don't know how that's not seen as an issue. It becomes dogmatic in a sense, and you're no longer. It also, you're actually no longer able to uncover your bias, because your bias is based on the facts that you have at a particular moment in time. So, that's one of the main takeaways that I have when, we have our discussions about the importance of mythos, is that you're discounting it, and it's no different than a dogmatic religion at that point. That it's only going to believe, you're only going to believe what comes out at one particular moment in time. We believe this today or tomorrow. And yeah, it's amazing. It's like almost, and to Donald's point, it's like your rules of inference are actually dictated to you. And that's weird. I'm sorry. I mean, it is what it is.
It's weird.
It's weird. I mean, I don't know. I can't even imagine that, actually. So, well, maybe that's my lack of imagination. I don't know, but it's yeah. That's one of the things that I think when we discount the power of mythos culture, or thinking, then you're basically discounting philosophy itself, because then now you're just reverting back to a very narrow view of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And what you actually said is that it discounts things like justice. That's the real danger. It discounts even courage and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's just my thoughts, basically what we've been talking about. I mean, I'm nothing, I'm not saying anything new, but it is interesting to think about how from a philosophical perspective it's discounted.
Yeah.
You're basically discounting philosophy itself.
Yeah.
And you're doing it through dogma.
Yeah.
And you're becoming biased in the process of actually trying to overcome your bias.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's really odd too. I mean, it's like
strange.
I'm using this instead of using the logic or just principles to overcome my bias. I'm using facts. I'm using particulars. And those particulars come with a bias. And so anyway, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's a lack of introspection at that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway.
But you're right. It produces very weird results in us. I mean, it's the weirdness of it. This is it's a Hegelian observation you're making, that our familiarity with the really weird things that we do convinces us that they're not weird, that they're normal, that there's nothing strange going on. And at the exact same moment that we might as well be hopping around in masks and feathers while all pretending that we're not doing it, we're doing equivalently strange things with our brains while pretending that we're not doing it. And to any observer from another epoch getting a good look at us, it would stand out immediately. What do you mean you don't have your thumb on the scales? Look, that's your thumb right there. It's attached to your hand. And we're like, no, that's not happening. It is a kind of madness that we're engaged in.
No, I mean, and it actually has deeper, implications even to how to negotiate things. And so, yeah, I mean, only looking at the world in facts, as opposed to principles, or philosophy in general.
Yeah.
Then that would be a pretty dangerous way to operate.
Yeah.
When you're talking about negotiations, because then it's just this for that.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. Yeah. So anyway, and
Okay.
instead of appealing to a higher level ideal.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I appreciate it. Thank
sorry.
you.
Yeah, sorry to go on.
No, it's good. Thank you. Yeah. There's the more the structure of the human mind, the more that the metabolism of the human mind comes into focus as what it actually might be. The more that our models begin to account for more of what's going on when we think, the stranger it looks. It's not at all the way any of us would have thought to design a mind. I mean, not Hegel, not Heraclitus, nobody, if they had set out to design a human mind, would have designed the thing that we evolved. And it's like studies of grip strength conclude that there were much better hand designs than the one we've got. And we're missing a thumb over here for one thing. In martial arts, you always break the grip on the weak side because it's weak. Why isn't there a second thumb? And the answer is, well, this wasn't designed. Nobody designed this, right? It developed step by step, and it's the same with our mind. And the fact that we can get it to work, is on the one hand not an accident at all. I mean, that's the whole point of evolution, is that the things that don't work don't survive. But the fact that it works the way that it does is just really strange. I've mentioned before this kind of Heraclitean idea that the cosmos has a simple set of appearances, in part because the actual paradoxes among the principles that generate those appearances, they're so hard for us to understand. Paradoxes are so confusing to the human mind that if the human mind was structured in such a way that we directly saw the paradoxes all the time, we'd have a very hard time operating in the world. And what we're seeing as we scratch through the surface of what he's talking about with mythos and logos is the idea that the structure of the human mind, this nature within, as Heraclitus calls it, is every bit as much the same, that we're walking on paradoxes. Everything is structured out of crazy paradoxes, that it's understandable why the finite rational mind would not want to see them. They make logic hard. They make reasoning hard. Go ahead, Joseph. I see you.
I just want to quickly add, if we were to discount logic and taking the reverse, right, we would be lost in our minds.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the difference. I mean, look at it from that perspective. Right, let's just say we completely discounted logic.
Right.
Okay, well, that would be an issue. I mean, I would think that we would, be, I don't know, stuck in labs trying to, kind of contemplate, just thinking about the world.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's if you take the converse, which is important to do in any argument, logically, well, then you don't want to discount either,
right?
It's and it comes back to having a balance of these two,
or a dynamic system where they're harnessed together.
A very dynamic system.
Yeah.
And a dynamic system's very, especially one as complicated as our minds, it's impossible to manage. So instead of just anyway, sorry.
Oh, that's great, Joseph. Thanks. All right, Stephen, and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen. What's on your mind?
I was just going to bring up a point of brought up before, and that's the question of tokenism. Goethe famously, and he wasn't the only one in the 18th century, pointed out that we generalize, and generalizing, it's connected with rationalization, is a very useful tool, can get us places very quick at the price that sometimes there's a lot of detail that we've missed. Now, you bring back the Christian or whatever, perhaps not Christian myth of the Garden of Eden, and Adam fell out of the Garden of Eden, and I think it might have been Goethe or Steiner or somebody like that that connected it with the ability, we gained the ability to generalize at a much greater degree than we had in the past. This was this external sort of intellectualism. Famously, of course, Adam, in one version of the tale, Adam notices he's naked. So he plucks a fig leaf and hides his little position. He says, "Hey, dude, I'm not naked anymore. I put on a token of clothing." And tokenism's all over the place, even though there's warnings against it. The good Jew, good Jewish merchant, good Jewish rich merchant goes to the synagogue, puts his money in the poor box, does all the tricks, goes home. That's proven he is a virtuous person, and he's more virtuous than the poor person who only put in a couple of coppers. He's put in a couple of silvers. Therefore, he's more virtuous. It's very easy to gain your virtue in tokenism. And now we're living in a culture which is captivated by Hollywood celebrities. Again, they're all saying, "Oh, I follow the right brand. I follow this token. I do that token." You only have to look on the outside. Don't look on the inside. Don't do the longer thing. Even the food becomes tokenistic. KFC. I can go to any KFC anywhere or any McDonald's anywhere and get exactly the same stuff. Generally pretty consistent, So there's my token restaurant. I don't actually have to engage my mind or order the food carefully or ask the waiter what this is. Everything's up front. There's a token. I can just run in and grab it. But tokenism might have its price. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I don't know if you've read the book Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, a comedy about the apocalypse. And I can't remember if it's Amazon Prime that has the first season of the TV series that Neil Gaiman made from it. And because he was directly involved in the creation of the series, it doesn't have the problem most adaptations do, where the adaptation is worse than the book. It's fantastic as he's visualized these ridiculous things that happen during the apocalypse. And the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse come and as part of it, and we get to see what they're up to before they're summoned. And each of them is up to their own particular form of mischief. Famine, the horseman Famine is he's at a restaurant. He's a savvy businessman. He's marketing a great new product to the restaurant. It's called Chow, the trademark on it. And Chow, has all of these food-like appearances, and it feels like food, and it tastes like food, and it's filling like food. Of course, it has absolutely no food value. So you could eat as much chow as you want and lose weight. And isn't that great? Then everybody gets to lose all the weight they want to lose. And this is Famine's new shtick for how to get everybody to starve voluntarily. And he's very proud of it. And there's this moment where the woman in the restaurant he's selling it to slips up and refers to it as food. He goes, no, the lawyers say you cannot refer to it as food. It's chow. If you call it food, you get in trouble with the FDA. It's a token for food. It's abstract food, not the actual thing. Satisfies what you want, just not what you need. When your description of the tokens really made me think about that moment. Phil, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, my comment refers to what Joseph was talking about in two ways. One way, it goes back to my discovery that Jacques Derrida, the word difference, right? In other words, the part that I really like was deferring. You know, when you defer, you not only spread it out to others to make a decision, but you spread it out in time. And I don't not necessarily mean defer to the future, but also defer to the past, because they have also some wisdom. So that was a good comment, that, you know, we can't just say this moment is the absolute moment, right? Like, deference is really something that spreads out in all directions. So that's good. The other thing I want to say about that was when he was talking, it immediately threw me back to the original movie, not the later remake of The Manchurian Candidate. We knew how the Manchurian Candidate was brainwashed to believe what he believed, and he's committed to create treason because he actually believed it. And so, but that came out of the Korean War, in which the Manchurian Candidate, Manchuria, is because it's China. You know, China has brainwashed them, so in some sense. So the funny thing about the Manchurian Candidate is, when you start thinking about it, capital is this softer, kinder Manchurian Candidate that we don't notice. You know, I mean, because it's softer and kinder, everything seems like, oh, it's fine. But we've all become this sort of like soft Manchurian Candidate that's in prison to the system. So that's why we find it harder to criticize our own structure, because it was so soft and kind. not like what happened in Manchuria to the prisoners, you know, who knows what they went through. Okay, so that's interesting. The soft and kind of, then you begin to wonder, like, yeah, what happened in China, what happened in Russia and all that. Yeah, okay, we could see that that's problematic, you know, because that's a hard, brutal kind, you know. That's under Stalin and Mao. But we have the softer and kinder that it's indetectable, that's seeped into our consciousness and has controlled us. So that's why we can't criticize it, because we're singing its songs. That's it, Phil. Thank you, Joseph.
Thanks, Phil.
Oh.
Yeah, that's the trick, right? That you know, if you're fighting against somebody who's punching and kicking you and blocking you, you might be able to just be stronger or faster. If you're fighting somebody who's judoing you, then it works to your disadvantage to be stronger and faster. It just means you hit the floor faster and harder than you would have, because it's your own strength being used against you. And you know, the really enduring systems, like worldviews for epochs, endure because they use our own strength against us. It's the critical thing about the difference between what's tragic and what's not tragic, which the ancient Greeks understood and which moderns don't. We call every bad thing that happens a tragedy. You know, there's a terrible car crash and 10 people die, and the news reporter says, tragedy on I-5 this evening. It's like, that wasn't a tragedy. That was just, you know, a disaster. Tragedy is when you're hoist on your own petard. None of this could have happened without your virtues. Your virtues brought you into this. And the more virtuous you are, the worse the outcome. It's the inversion and the judo against yourself that makes it a tragedy. And so, you know, when we're talking about the structure of the human mind and our predilection for delusions and ideologies that make it so that the harder we think, the more we convince ourselves of the validity of the trap that we're in, rather than questioning it, this is a tragic inversion state of affairs. Right? To the Greeks, it would have been, I mean, these ideas about the structure of tragedy were in wide circulation throughout classical Greek culture. They all talk every time they went to watch a play. They talk about these things, whereas we mostly don't get it. If you read the Wikipedia article, you won't see any reference to tragic inversion. Right? Wikipedia doesn't understand that tragic inversion has anything to do with tragedy or even what it might be. You know, we're just not used to thinking that we are the authors of our own misfortune, you know, not the sole authors, but necessary co-authors when it comes to tragic circumstances. Not every bad thing that happens is a tragedy, but the ones that are tragedies, they're tragedies because we did this. As Poco says, we've met the enemy and he is us. He's discussing a tragedy, right? He's saying, you know, polluting our own world is a tragic situation in which we convince ourselves that we're throwing it away without realizing that it's not going anywhere. It's just right here with us on our planet, in our way. So, all right. So next bit of text I wrote about this. So there is this, it is very hard for us to conceive of this idea that the Greek transition from mythos to logos wasn't a march of progress from the more primitive to the more advanced. It's natural for us to assume that it must be. The idea that we devolved from an adult culture that could handle ambiguity and complexity into a more banausic, oversimplifying, formal, literal-minded, mechanical culture that's inferior to what it replaced, that's hard for us to comprehend. But the reasons are straightforward. I mean, logos culture, it's really, Verstandt's strength is in predicting and controlling the future, right? The more valid scientific theorems you have, the more you understand mechanically how to work the substance of the world to create weapons and shields and money and you know, Greek fire, triremes, the more you can dominate militarily. You know, the rise as the Greeks succeeded against the Persian invasion and consolidated and organized themselves, this required more and more Verstand to coordinate the behavior of large numbers of people and large number of resources over a large area. So there were benefits to the logos culture. They became stronger. They became more effective. And we'll see this theme come up again when we talk about Rome. It was like the major turning point in Rome was when, although they had a pantheon before that in their republic and respected many different forces, Mars came to rise above all other powers because Rome discovered their stupid pet trick could be if we just conquer everybody else and enslave them, then, you know, we grow and we get more powerful, seemingly an endless loop. So they became more and more anti-philosophical and more less mythic, less mythos culture, and more logos culture, more focused on build the road as fast as possible, build the aqueduct as fast as possible, build as many swords as possible, organize as many people into a military formation as possible. This gave them power. Logos, you know, Verstand is good at power, right? I mean, why did people fund Galileo? And then he got funded because he helped them militarily. His inventions aided in the development of powerful militaries during the Renaissance. That's where his funding came from. Why do people fund science in universities today? Well, they fund it for profit because that's what we're interested in. You know, the science that obviously generates short-term enormous profits gets more funding than the science that might teach us how to be kinder, gentler people, right? Because where's the profit in that? So there is this way in which the shift from mythos to logos culture can be both an inevitable development of the culture and also passing the prime and beginning the decay at the same time, right? It's like when we pass our prime physically, it's not that all things get worse. We can still get wiser and more experienced, right? We can still do good and develop the ability to do good in forms that we never could have done in our prime or before our prime. We have a lot to offer. And it's the same is true of the logos culture Greeks. They had an enormous amount to offer when they were past their prime. But the fact that they gave so much less credence to gnosis than they used to meant that they could get themselves into messes like the Peloponnesian War more easily than they could during their prime, right? When they were flourishing at their prime, they set aside their differences and came together as a whole people to resist the Persian invasion. But past their prime, even when they weren't being invaded, they couldn't set aside their differences enough to keep from tearing themselves to pieces. So you can see how the growth of the power in the Logos culture accompanied a shrinkage of the wisdom such that they misused the power against themselves. This was the natural development, right, of a culture that in order to survive the Persian invasion absolutely had to get more powerful. They had to, so they did, but it came with a price. The price was those who live by the sword die by the sword, right? It's some of these old adages have a certain amount of wisdom lurking in them. So this is the thing that, you can't have a bunch of individualists questioning whether it's a good idea for you to be in this phalanx when you're trying to stop the Persian invasion. You have to be better at suppressing individuality and encouraging a more fascist alignments where you're able to act as a bundle of reeds, any one of which the Persians could have snapped. But now that you're together, the Persians can't snap you and you can snap them. And, that's the end of the Persian invasion. The problem comes when afterwards Athens is like, wow, it's really great having all this money and having all these people obedient to us. I want to keep the fasces together. And the individual city-states are like, no, now that we've defeated the Persians, let's go back to being equals. And Athens says, no, let's not split up the fasces. And furthermore, I'm willing to fight over it and keep you from leaving. There is this, the whole thing, it develops naturally. So there's a more banausic focus afterwards on keeping the power and a less eristic focus on questioning whether the power is wise. And if you read the Peloponnesian War, the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, with that perspective in mind, you can see that Thucydides is an Aristos who's critiquing the downfall of his own city-state. How, in his own generation, how did we go from a population that had so many Aristoi that we could pull together and defeat the Persians to, by the time he's writing his history, a population that had so few Aristoi in positions of power that we couldn't even keep from blowing up our own city-state? I mean, because the end result of the Peloponnesian War is Athens loses everything and Sparta's in charge. All Athens had to do to remain free was not pick a fight, but they couldn't do it because the banausic reasoning made it seem obvious that they should. They calculated their way to a conclusion that was foolish. And this was Logos culture in action. So literal-minded mechanizing decision-making that misses the forest for the trees, measures every tree completely and fails to notice that there's a forest. This is typical of the difference that Logos culture encourages, that kind of misreading of reality. Mythos culture, the whole point of mythos culture is to make sure you can't possibly miss the forest, even when you're in it. The major, most important things are kept in the consciousness of the population. That's what myth is for. And in the absence of myth, people start forgetting not addresses or phone numbers or where they put their water bottle. They start forgetting things like, I wonder if maybe we shouldn't fight against each other. I wonder if it would be stupid to self-destroy. Sharon, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So I just have a simple request. This last paragraph where you explain the movement from mythos to logos, it's not in the text, right?
No, I wrote that.
Oh, so how can I get it?
When we get through this, I'll start. I'll send you copies. But at the moment, that's why I'm pasting it into the chat, is so that we don't lose it. I've got it on my computer. I edit this stuff before each of these sessions a little bit and try to figure out what some text.
This is brilliant, actually. And so I wanted to read it over and digest it because this was the focus of the question that I asked.
Yeah, that's why I posted it. For you, Sharon. This whole section is for you.
I was tempted to say, you're not going to get it. You already got it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I want like to paste and copy it. I mean, I know it's not released or it's not written yet. I just wanted to meditate on it. That's it.
sure. Yeah, I'll by next week I'll figure out how to get you copies of this stuff.
This is great.
Thank you.
Okay.
And you know, when we eventually publish his column in the book Millennia and Microcosm, David and I will, you know, we'll probably include this stuff as footnotes or endnotes or something. So yeah, so that's that. So yeah, so this is the thing is, you know, from a logos culture perspective, from a Verstand perspective, we look back on the Greek myths and we cannot overlook all the what to us looks like irrationality and falsehoods in it. They stand out heavily because the attention of the Verstand mind, the awareness of the Verstand mind, is magnetically oriented towards measurable facts. And it's, by the same token, it's magnetically oriented away from the big picture. You know, justice, happiness, you know, what might be true or not be true. These are, you know, in the larger picture, what is the purpose of a human life? How should we organize society? These are things that the Verstand mind can't deal with because they don't lend themselves directly to logic and measurement the way that facts do. So the result is we look at the myth and all we can see is what looks to us like contamination, right? We see the fragments of attempts to explain the physical phenomena of the world, and we conclude that must have been the purpose of the myth, and that therefore, by our standards, the myth is a failure. It's got too much what we call irrationality mixed into it, contaminating it, so that it can't do its job. And we want to purify it because we want pure logic, pure theories, things that are true in all places for all times. And what we miss by doing that, among the things we miss by doing that, is that, and this is the hardest thing for a writer to come to understand, there's no such thing as something that you can write for all times and all ages. It can't be done. Because communication isn't an abstraction. It's not you just emitting meaning into the cosmos. Communication is an act between one person and another. So for every writer, there must be an audience. Who specifically are you writing to? And that audience has a certain worldview. There are things they're predisposed to understand and things they're predisposed not to understand. If you're going to craft anything like a wisdom literature that's going to be comprehended by a population, it can't be written abstractly as an equation for all people for all time. It has to be written for those specific people because that's how you get them to grasp it, through their idiom, through their worldview, through their culture. The Greek myths don't satisfy, you know, a logician in the modern world because they weren't written for a logician in the modern world. They were written for, you know, a largely illiterate, uneducated people trying to survive. And they used the stories those people were already familiar with in novel, unforgettable ways to try to capture the attention and memory of that population to help them uplift themselves out of Douleia through Benausea into Aristeia. Right? All myths, to do their job, have to be concrete for a specific people. And the fact that they don't satisfy somebody else is not a flaw. If anything, it's a virtue. Right? Because any attempt to make a myth that didn't have that flaw would also be missing the virtue. By the time you go through myths and rip out of them all this contaminating, polluting subjectivity from the modern perspective, what you're left with is so arid, it's completely forgettable. It's not memorable at all. It is the contamination with irrationality that makes it memorable, that makes it able to do its job as a myth. And in this, you see one of the recurring themes that Kenneth Smith has all the time about the flaws of Verstand. He says, Verstand leads us to want completely unnatural, irreal, impossible, unhealthy things. Like we want to live forever, which no mortal can do. It completely ignores the life cycle. It ignores why there's a life cycle in us. It shows a profound ignorance of the life cycle and its role in creating us in the first place. If there weren't a life cycle, there wouldn't be an us, right? This is what produces us. But we're not satisfied with existing. We want this irreal thing that can't happen for us. It's the same when we I can't remember who it was that was saying, maybe it was who was saying that we also want to be anybody that we could possibly want to be. We want to know everything we could possibly want to know. But again, both of those problems run up against our finitude. They're impossible things. They aren't, not only aren't they possible to have, they're not even possible, they're not even healthy to want. It twists us to be chasing after living forever, to be chasing after knowing everything, to be chasing after being able to have to speak all the languages and have all the skills and do anything that we want to do and have perfect freedom. We destroy the possibility of a meaningful life here and now, where we could actually take steps to make things better for people. Right? There is a way, and I say this as one of those kids who in school was smarter than most of the other kids. And I had that stupid dream of saying, maybe I can learn everything. Wouldn't that be great? I could learn everything. But in trying to learn everything, it made me a dilettante. Right? Because it gets in, you only got 24 hours in a day. What are you spending them doing? If you're not spending at least some of them focusing on something, you're never going to get depth knowledge and depth expertise in anything. You're only ever going to get shallow knowledge. And shallow knowledge lends itself to Verstand, lends itself to gross generalities and drawing false conclusions about things based on the caricatures in your own mind. I went through this whole intellectual stage as a direct result of that. It was, I suppose, inevitable. But it puts me in a better position to understand. And now as I write things for my work or for you guys here, I'm always conscious of the fact that I can't write something that will speak to everybody. I can only write something that will speak to a specific audience. And that's what a myth maker is trying to do. So they were only able to create these myths that were effective because they knew the population they were writing for. They were part of the population that they were writing for. They knew what moved them, what were the deep emotional stories and the realities of their life. And that allowed them to find the paradoxes, the unforgettable paradoxes that would allow them to craft these stories that could weave in insights into the virtues and principles. But again, to a modern, that's inconceivable. We're supposed to be writing timeless mathematical equations and logical syllogisms and great works of law that will stand for thousands of years. We're supposed to be doing these eternal, things that speak to all people. And in refusing to speak to the concrete realities of any particular people, we end up speaking to no one. Anyone who sat down to read the US law code in search of inspiration is going to find themselves, first bored, then asleep. And after a while, clawing your eyes out, desperate to do anything but read another line of whereases and see section 7.4i 3.6. It's brain killing, mind killing, and attention killing trying to read this abstract crap. But it's really easy to remember the fox and the grapes, or the riddle of the Sphinx. They stick with you. That's the power of myth. Phil, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm going to say something that actually is in some way not reflected in our discussion. I want to warn you that I'm going to leave just a little early because I'm going to go to a meeting on it's called Let It Rot, reinterpretation of Antigone and Parallax. And it sounds really interesting, like the Antigone could remain so vibrant and alive. And from what I could tell, it is a very, very radical interpretation because, going back to the myth, like the problem was between Creon and Antigone about the holiness of the human body and the need for the state to let it rot. So that sounds like what I said about how holy the human body was
It sounds great.
to the ancients. So I'm saying this, so it relates in that small sense, but
Yeah.
that's why I have to leave early. I just want to explain you so you'll not feel like I have abandoned you.
Thanks, Phil. Enjoy. It sounds great. If I had time, I'd go too. That sounds like my kind of jam. So, part of what the conclusion I'm trying to draw here about this thing about the mythic mind is that the mythic mind, and we see this in the polytheism of the ancient Greeks, is more tolerant of ambivalence and complication and nuance and conflict. You see it epitomized in Heraclitus saying war is the father of all things, which strikes us as pretty offensive, at some level. But, he's trying to get at the idea that, as he says, it is only through the internal struggles of things that we produce the state we identify as rest. The enormous amount of work goes on inside the body to sleep, and we take it for granted that that's not happening, but that's a misunderstanding of the cosmos. And now, as a consequence of this, the tidiness of the logical categories that Verstand prefers leads it towards a preference for purity and valuing purity as a good thing, and pollution and contamination being demonized as bad things. So what we're going to find is that the rise of logos culture corresponds to a kind of what Kenneth calls, and what David Royal frequently reminds us that Kenneth calls, a kind of barbarism, in which we think that only things that can be justified in utilitarian terms should be allowed to exist, and everything else should be eliminated. On the one hand, it sounds like pragmatism, but on the other hand, there's a program of genocide built into that pragmatism, which is the idea that non-pragmatic things should not exist. You see that in the eugenics movement of the early 20th century. Anybody who can't carry their weight should die, or at least not reproduce, get them out of the gene pool. This kind of purity culture, this obsession with cleanliness and purity, you can see how it's useful for Verstand. In vitro experiments are more controllable. They're less messy than trying to describe what actually happens in a forest or in a human body. And there's a certain kind of person who's always drawn away from in vivo analysis and towards in vitro for that very reason. That longing for purity doesn't just show up in useful ways, like in an operating room where we keep the contamination out of the human body while we're operating, but it also shows up conceptually in people trying to find the one right truth and to exterminate all the false truths. The longing for orthodoxy, the rise of what will become the medieval epoch, finds its seeds in part in logos culture and in Verstand's craving of clean, pure, perfect examples that prove the validity of our theology or our ideology or our logic. All of that flows directly out of this transformation. It's no accident that what happens, after the turning points in Greek culture is the rise of increasingly pragmatic and militaristic Verstand approaches to culture, culminating in Rome, ultimately leading to the downfall of the ancient epoch and its replacement by the medieval. And of course, the medieval epoch is, among other things, characterized on the one hand by a greater focus on the divine and the sacred, but it comes at the cost of being paired with an obsession with purity that manifests as a program of genocide. And for 1,000 years, medieval Europe attempts to exterminate all other religions in Europe. And they do, on the one hand, a surprisingly good, and I have to put it in quotes because it's evil, a surprisingly good job. But on the other hand, as we've mentioned before, they generate heresies about as fast as they exterminate them, so that in the end they never actually succeed in their program, and the rising differences of conscience ultimately tear apart the medieval epoch and replace it with the modern during the Reformation. There's a way in which The genocidal impulses of purification culture are self-destroying, and we're gonna see that happen. But in critiquing modernity in terms of the ancient worldview, it's helpful to remember that the ancient worldview, whatever it may call itself or imagine itself to be, is actually the child of the medieval worldview. We are medievalists with some edits. Some things have been swapped around, but other things have been brought forth intact in us. And part of it is the obsession with reason and logic, and along with that, an obsession with purity, cleanliness, clean logic, and with the truth destroying falsehood and being in control, eliminating the chaos by eliminating all the pollution. The seeds of genocide and slavery and world wars are baked right into us in the modern epoch, and because they're compatible with reason and logic. You can logic your way into deciding that some population isn't as human as you are, isn't as worthwhile as you are, because you're not dealing with them as concrete people. You're dealing with them as abstract categories that you've defined logically for yourself. Now, this direct relationship between logic and these terrible things that happen in the modern epoch is something that moderns in particular do not want to look at, do not want to draw attention to. We don't want to see how they come together, how they are interdependent on each other. It's not that nobody ever tried to enslave anybody. It's not that nobody ever tried to kill or exterminate anybody. It's that nobody's as good at it as we are. It's our superpower, right? Because power and pragmatism are our thing. And when you combine a greater facility for power and pragmatism with an obsession with purity, the things that result aren't good. They're not good. It's actually easy. Rather than being baffling, it's easy to see why the great sins of the modern epoch are distinctively modern once we get below the surfaces of how we define ourselves. So mythos and logos. So mythos has the messiness that it includes the subjective and the objective, gnosis and noesis, begriff and Verstand, and it harnesses them together to use them against each other to keep either one from becoming a tyrant over our mind and allowing us freedom of choice that we wouldn't have otherwise as long as we were mere symptoms of one or the other ideology. This is kind of what he's getting at here with this distinction between mythos and logos. So when he says that ancient Greek culture transitioned from a mythos culture to a logos culture, he's not just saying it became more rational. He's certainly not saying rational in any modern sense. He's saying it became more noetic. And as a result of becoming more noetic, it became more powerful, more ideological, and more prone to make spectacular blunders on a scale it couldn't have made before. That's part of what it means to make this transition. So we'll wrap it up here. We'll pick it up next week. But I think you could see how at this point we've really come to the crux of the issue. And we're beginning to draw implications out of it. And I think we'll find that the paragraphs to come, we're going to move faster and faster through them because it all follows from this right here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
Yes.
Have a great week, everyone.
Yeah.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.